Hello, everybody. A very, very exclusive group joining us today for our final Tech Talk of the year. So welcome all. Tech Talk's been one of the really exciting things that's evolved from the Australia at Home experiment this year. It started as a one-off event with the Human Rights Commissioner Ed Santow and Lizzie O'Shea and I, probably week 2 of the lockdown. And here we are at the end of the year, and we're really pleased to have Ed back with us today. And so we've got Lizzie, we've got Ed, and we've got our regular Dan Stinton, Managing Director of Guardian Australia. And what we thought to do today is just go through a year in review, but really keen to hear from all of you in the chat as well. And I thought we'd divide the discussion up into 3/3 as we tend to: highlights, lowlights, and what next. So that's going to be the way we'll approach this discussion. Before I get cracking, just to recognise that we are all on Indigenous land and pay respects to elders past, present, emerging. I'm on Gadigal land. I recognise this land was never ceded, and I'm sure you'll join me in paying those respects. So, wow, 2020, the year that started with a bushfire and ends kind of ended with this just sigh of relief that we got through the year and absolute exhaustion, but things still moving apace. As you know, this week, you would have seen the bargaining code introduced into federal parliament. You've got privacy review going on through AGs, which is the building blocks of coming up with some sort of data protocol in Australia. You've got Ed's fantastic work moving through the Human Rights Commission globally. You've got antitrust cases against Google and Facebook, and we could go on. So just on a year where we were all forced to disrupt the way we lived our lives, it seems we've also disrupted our relationship with technology and adapted it, and even using a platform like this. So I thought just welcome everybody, and let's just go around the grounds with my very loose framework. So let's start with you, Lizzie. Highlight of 2020.
Oh, well, I mean, I think that it is a year that's been characterised by the regulation of big tech and various manoeuvres to try and implement that. So it's hard to ignore those pretty significant steps forward towards a space in which tech companies are not able to just get away with things as they have in the past, that they're also on notice themselves, and you can see in how they behave that they're quite worried about, containing that regulatory impulse. And I think that is a sign we should take as a positive. So people probably saw that the FTC has just sued Facebook the other day, I think yesterday. And it's really interesting to read the articles analysing this particular move, as well as obviously the FTC's comments themselves. And it's talking about potentially reversing some of the mergers, the acquisition of Instagram and Facebook, Instagram and WhatsApp by Facebook, but also looking at the analysis behind that. So much of antitrust law in recent times has been focused on consumer welfare. And in a context in which you don't pay for this service, it's very difficult to argue that there's some problem with consumer welfare, because price is the usual mechanism that's used by courts and the law to assess consumer welfare. But there's a lot of interesting analysis now that suggests that degrading privacy is potentially also a measure of consumer welfare. And it's really interesting to go back and look at the history of Facebook, where when they first made their offering as a service, they did offer far superior privacy protections. They talked about not using cookies. They talked about your profile only being visible by default to people you knew. And gradually over time, that severely degraded, particularly as they've faced fewer and fewer meaningful competitors. And so there's a real argument here that privacy now is a key indicator of consumer welfare, but that also it's most grossly undermined when there's a monopoly in a particular market, and social media is one such monopoly. So I think that's a really interesting development, really positive, and I'm glad to see this idea that we're shifting away from this indicator of price being the sole one for determining consumer welfare. I still think the FTC is going to face a bit of an uphill battle, and I think it's going to be a highly contested bit of litigation. But it's a nice way to round out the year, I have to say, because it kind of does show how far we've come from last year, from, even 2016, which is where I really think the table started to turn, when people became aware that tech companies hold far too much power, when regulators were put on notice that they needed to start moving to fix that, and lawmakers started to see the advantages in talking about holding tech to account. I mean, let's see how it unfolds with Biden, but to me, that kind of year is, or looking at that year in review, I think we've made some some great, impressive leaps forward. So I'm sure others on the panel would agree with me on that, but I think it would be remiss not to start at least from that perspective.
Yeah, Ed, it seems like one of the things that comes out of this year with respect to what Lizzie's saying is this notion of it's not so much a partisan effort either. Like it's not being driven by one side of politics in the States or even one level of government. And likewise in Australia, there seems to be a bipartisan acceptance that business as usual probably isn't sustainable for democracy.
I think that's right. I mean, I think this is the year where we as a community really woke up. I remember when we started this project on human rights and technology about 2.5 years ago. It was still a really pervasive message that the tech world was putting out there, which is that they're there to change the world, right? Like you had everyone from Elizabeth Holmes and everyone in that industry would truly say that, and they'd say it with a straight face that that they're really there just to help people flourish. And yes, they may be making money hand over fist, but gosh, that's just a pain in the neck. You don't realize how much they're spending on accountants' fees, and they're really just just like any NGO. While I think there were mavens like Lizzie who saw through that much earlier than the rest of the community, I think this was the year where I think that that lie, and let's be honest, it's not true, became much clearer to the rest of us. And I think what you're seeing, and Lizzie's pointed to a number of examples of this, you're seeing regulators, legislators, and others, and for that matter, citizens who are also consumers, starting to actually change their behaviour. So we're starting to see new legislative action. We're starting to see regulators step up. We've been saying for a while now that we think that regulators have been too slow, and we have directed that same criticism to ourselves. And I think that's starting to change, and I think that's really positive, because I'm not averse to all forms of technology, far from it. But what I do think is we need to be clear-eyed about what the positives that new technology like AI brings, but also be equally clear-eyed about what the risks and threats of harm are, because unless we understand those, and we're not going to address them, and I think we'll be all the poorer for it.
So just on your work, do you see the external zeitgeist shift making it easier for you to push forward some of the work you're trying to do, or are we overstating that shift?
I think it's more a subtle change than a really extensive one. I mean, we released a big technical paper last month. It's truly for the boffins. It's on a subject called algorithmic bias. It's basically when algorithms are used to make decisions, they can result in unfairness and even unlawful discrimination. And this technical paper for the boffins, as I say, is there to help companies who want to use this sort of technology do so in a way that is going to be at the very least lawful, and ideally will also be actively and positively fair, so to address some of those problems. I think if we've been having this conversation a year or two, or we were having this conversation a year or two ago, and I think a lot of companies said to us, look, that sort of patted us on the head saying, well, that's really interesting, tell us more about it, but a long time into the future. Whereas now I think what we're seeing in a really positive way is companies proactively coming to us. We worked with the CSIRO, with Choice, Consumer Policy Research Centre, and the Grain Institute, and saying, no, we've actually got to address this. This is a legal risk. It's also a reputational risk. We want to do the right thing. How the hell do we do it? And that's good. I don't want to overstate it. I think there's more work to be done, but I think there is a shift.
Yeah, great. Dan, welcome. You've been in the trenches the last few weeks with a number of others of us trying to land this media bargaining code, but I'm interested in how that fits into your context of the year and what you'd say your highlight of 2020 has been.
This is probably going to demonstrate how little preparation we've done for today, but I'm going to echo Lizzie's points pretty substantially.
Not good. Agreed.
But look, I think I think it's really important. I think this has been the year, more than any year, where what people like Lizzie and me much later, but certainly a few of us were saying for the last few years, this is where the world woke up to it. I mean, we've, most recently, obviously, the FTC action against Facebook is, I think, a really welcome, problematic in a lot of ways, but a really welcome move nonetheless. With DOJ's action against Google, similarly, we've seen EU copyright directive recently as well, where Google and Facebook are going to be required to pay publishers in that territory. And then closer to home, obviously, what I've spent the vast majority of this year working on is the bargaining code between the digital platforms and the media companies. But as well as that, we also don't forget we kicked off a review of the Privacy Act 1988, which is long, long overdue. We sort of touched on this briefly a few weeks ago. I think we should probably have another conversation about it at some stage. But it's just really great to see that finally the world is waking up to the power of big tech, and there's heaps of good that comes. A lot of good that comes with this these technology companies, but there's also lots of risks and harms. And just one specific thing on this, by the way. I mean, Lizzie touched on the point about it's really hard to sort of to see consumer harms on these products when they're all free. But I think the other really encouraging thing about a lot of the anti-competitive actions that we're seeing is that it's not just based around consumer harms. It's also now being based around political power that is amassing to these companies because they're so substantial. And that's going back to kind of where competition law started 100 years ago, and that's a really, really welcome development. And I'll just say one more thing. I mean. To be on perhaps a slightly more positive highlight, if you like, is I've loved the fact that we've been able to use technology in really amazing ways this year because of the pandemic. I mean, just imagine if this pandemic had hit 20 years ago, how much more difficult it would have been for us. We wouldn't have had conversations like this, for example. I certainly wouldn't have been able to communicate with all of my colleagues, let alone all my friends that I've spoken to around the world because of all these technologies. And so there is a lot of good that comes with these products as well, right? So which we should all remember.
Yeah, I think that's right. And we've had a great time getting to find ways of connecting, and we wouldn't have done it. We would have probably, I think, particularly Lizzie, you, me, probably may have had a couple of face-to-face conversations over the year if we were lucky. Probably would have never met a lot of the people that have joined in the chat. It feels that it is a new way of connecting that can only be, developed and grown on. But before we move beyond the ACCC, Lizzie, I know we've exchanged views in the past. So I don't really want to re-prosecute the rights and wrongs of the bargaining code, but I'm interested in your view, particularly as a legal practitioner and around the frame. The ACCC is meant to be there a bit like, the old antitrust laws to construct markets in support of capitalism. But I think actually what we're seeing is effectively social outcomes. I think the value in the ACCC code is not so much about the commercial deal, but the recognition that we need independent journalism. And I think that encroaching of legal frameworks that have been set up ostensibly to construct markets to look at broader social outcomes has been really interesting this year. Yeah,
I mean, the ACCC's mandate is to look at competition and consumer issues. So both those things, I think, influence how our democratic structures work, and they can give people rights as well as impose responsibilities on powerful actors in society. I mean, it's a regulator as well as delivering kind of policy proposals like it did with the digital platforms inquiry. It's also a regulator that takes issues of its own bat and enforces the laws. So I mean, I'm really glad that we've got the ACCC. This was my least favourite recommendation from the report that they did hand down in respect of digital platforms, as I'm sure everybody who's seen me talk about this knows full well. And there's something a little grating about having some, I think, very legitimate criticisms and watching the media be awash with praise for this particular proposal, because it reminds me of when there's a bill tabled in Parliament to give politicians a pay rise. You're not going to get anyone who speaks against it, and it feels a little bit like there's a bunch of institutional actors here who really like this, and it's very difficult to get a word in edgeways, and that's a bit frustrating for me, because I'm really interested to see how this unfolds. And I personally have a strong feeling it's not going to work as intended for a variety of different reasons. And I accept now it looks likely that it will proceed, and it looks as though it's going through a process of consultation, of course. But if it does pass, then I think it will be curious to watch how perhaps some of these unintended consequences are addressed in the media and by advocates in this space generally, and politicians, because I think there's a couple of items where it could go a bit wrong. And people, I'm sure, know about this, but I'm happy to expand on any of this if you'd like, Peter. But I don't know whether everyone's sick of listening to me about it.
Look, I think these conversations aren't circular and they don't end. Like, I think that part of the landing of the code is it's part of a package. I think it's right. It'll be interesting to see how the media companies respond to other parts of the package, particularly around protection and rights for consumers. It's interesting. One of the recommendations on privacy that's gone to the AG is whether political parties' exemption from privacy laws should be reviewed and ended. And that's one where I'll be really interested to see if there's bipartisan support to address that particular recommendation. So, look, my view has always been, if the Parliament was going to start regulating big tech, if they weren't going to do it with the support of News Limited, then when would they? I've spoken about my Venn diagram. There's a narrow bit where public interest and News Limited interest intersect. I suspect this is it, but it will be in the doing. We'll see over the next 6 to 12 months whether we have a stronger media out the other end, or whether the changes that were brought through at the last minute, particularly the way that arbitration would be worked out, means that it won't actually deliver much at all.
I mean, if I could just say one thing, though, I think one thing to keep an eye on for people in this chat who are kind of consumers of this kind of news and interested observers, I do think one thing we do have to keep an eye on is the impact on the public broadcaster. One of my big concerns actually about including them in this code is that it will create an alternative source of revenue that could justify further cuts to the ABC. And I think if we want a good ABC that continues to engage in investigative journalism, that continues to resource regional, certainly non-metro bureaus and the like, then we really need the funding to come from government. And I am a bit concerned that now having an alternative source of revenue from major tech platforms will justify further cuts. And I think that's something we all need to keep an eye on, and avoid allowing particularly the coalition government to continuously starve the ABC of funds because it doesn't like what it's doing.
Yeah, I think the head of the ABC is very strategically said any extra money will go into regional reporting. Hopefully that puts a bit of a ring around it. Ed, what's your view of the bargaining code from the cheap seats?
Look, we haven't got a final position on this. We're stuck on the fence for now. We are concerned, I guess, about some of the broader issues regarding the way in which our democracy relies on, a functioning media to be able to communicate genuine news and information, and we've got a big structural problem. This is going to probably not satisfy anyone, this answer, but I do think it's a start. The code, it's not perfect, and I think I agree with many of Lizzie's critiques. But I'm also, I guess, in the market of the possible, and it does concern me that there aren't a lot of other kind of options that are realistically on the table at the moment to start to address these problems.
Dan, do you want to weigh in?
Yes, it won't surprise anyone that I'm going to disagree with Lizzie on whether this was the most important recommendation from the Atriple C's review. It's certainly my favourite recommendation, although I do accept the point, by the way, in all seriousness, that probably this and privacy, I think, are the two most important areas, or the two most important areas of recommendations from the Atriple C Digital Platforms Inquiry. But as I've said many times, so I won't go down a huge rabbit hole of this, but just a summary position. I think journalism is a public good, and the business model of journalism has been massively undermined by the platforms, and therefore this code does something to mitigate that. It's certainly not going to solve it, by the way. I mean, the payments we're not going to get from these companies, I mean, I could be wrong, but I don't think it's certainly not going to be of a quantum which is going to be equivalent to the amount of advertising dollars that have come out of news media. But it will go some way. And I can say, without, I'm going to be a little bit careful here, but without going into specifics of it, I can say that already the has resulted in much more promising conversations with the platforms for The Guardian. And I am sure that, or I think it's likely that we're going to end up doing agreements with them, which will go towards us funding substantially more journalists in Australia. And I think that's for the good. So, yeah, I mean, look, I think it's a really substantial step that this has gone into Parliament. I take your point, Lizzie. Obviously, this is a piece of legislation which everyone in the media, or almost everyone in the media, is in furious agreement with, and it's not often that happens, and perhaps a little unfair. But I work in the media, so I'm delighted. I'm delighted that it's happened, and I think it's going to result in a lot more journalists being hired.
I just jump in on the privacy bit,
yeah.
Peter. So, I must admit, feeling a bit jaded about that. In that I was working at the Law Reform Commission 15 years ago when we came up with, you know, a pretty solid recommendation for privacy reform. The then government kind of sat on it for a couple of years. Then they sent that reform to review within the department, and then that went back to the Law Reform Commission to do yet another privacy review, and then it was back and forth, and we've now got another review. We're really good at doing reviews sometimes, but not so good at actually enacting change. And that's one of the areas where the government actually at some point has to bite the bullet and do something. And so that's something that is a bit of a concern, that there's yet another review.
By the way, sorry, Pete, can I jump in? The one difference I think this time around, I mean, I completely understand your frustrations, Ed, but the one reason why I think this time is hopefully going to be different is Australia is actually now starting to be penalised in our dealings with the EU and the US because we don't have sufficient privacy regulations in place. And so I think there's now an imperative, a commercial imperative for us to do it. I mean, if you take The Guardian, for example, we have had to implement a whole bunch of things at The Guardian in Australia just in order to be able to comply with what the EU needs. And if we hadn't done that, it would have been really difficult for us commercially. And I think that's going to result, that kind of pressure is going to flow across every other media organisation, indeed every other organisation that collects consumer data. And therefore, I think we're likely to see change. Whether it's going to be substantial enough, I mean, we covered this a few weeks ago, so I won't go into it now, but I really hope we learn the lessons of GDPR and CCPA and actually put just some guardrails around what can't be done irrespective of consent when we go down this path, because it's a really pressing need, I think. And I think I would put this alongside, I wouldn't put it above, but I put this alongside the Digital Platforms Code as being the most important area of regulatory reform that we need.
So Ed, were your regret that it's taken this long to move on privacy, is that your low light of the year, or have you got something more dour to share with us that's really frustrated you about technology this year?
That's been the low light of every year since 2005.
Lucy's got a particular question for you in the chat, which is your view on this, an idea of a statutory tort for violation of privacy. So I might weave that in at this stage.
Yeah, well, I mean, it wouldn't be a panacea, but it would definitely help. And you know, the reason we know it wouldn't be a panacea is that most other jurisdictions now have a statutory tort of invasion of privacy, and it's not like all of the problems, you know, in the UK are dealt with. I wonder whether, I mean, let me make this more concrete. The thing that really kind of upsets me about where we've got to in privacy this year is it's kind of summed up in the way in which facial recognition is being used by police forces. So in the UK has probably been the most enthusiastic adopter of facial recognition by police outside of course, countries like China. And, you know, some of the early data from some of their trials is truly shocking, you know, huge error rates, you know, 98% false positive rate, that sort of thing. And I guess, you know, what I was expecting to see this year is the year where they go, okay, well, this isn't working, we're going to do something a bit different. But actually the opposite has been true. they've doubled down. So there are now expanded trials of facial recognition by police forces in the United Kingdom. And you know, there's now these trials are taking place, I guess, in circumstances where we know it doesn't work, where we know that it leads to people being falsely accused of offences and potentially falsely arrested and detained and so on. And so it really worries me that the lesson we've taken from those failures is that we just need to keep on doing the same thing, because that's kind of mind-blowing.
Lizzie, I know you guys have been active in this.
We're running a campaign at Digital Rights Watch about facial recognition. I'm sure Lucy will post a link in the chat to things that we've been up to. I mean, I do think it is interesting that Amazon, for example, is committed to no longer selling facial recognition software to police in the United States off the back of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think that's the kind of force that we're going to need to see to arrest this technology, rather than relying on the better nature of lawmakers to understand the grave harm that's posed by this technology. And so I think it is interesting that it shows that protest movements do have a role to play, I think, in shifting policy debates quite effectively sometimes when there's a deadlock at the political level. But you did ask me, Peter, if I had a low light, so I thought I might throw it into the mix. Probably the low light for me was around the election of the Biden administration also had Prop 22 on the ballot in California, which was put there by Uber. And I just feel like that's a pretty depressing moment in the history of social democracy, where a company essentially ran an astroturfing campaign to get a proposition up which strips people who work on their platform from their rights and imposes a requirement that to reverse the law, there be a 7/8 majority within the legislative body. And what I think this represents is the pointy end of a much broader campaign that we often don't see behind doors, where tech companies talk to and influence policymakers and elected representatives. I mean, we've talked a lot today about their moves to regulate these platforms, but you know, in the last 10 years, tech companies have spent $500 million lobbying people in Washington DC. We're now looking at a Biden transition team with executives from companies like Uber and Lyft, from Salesforce, from a list of pretty much except Facebook, because Joe Biden's team are pretty anti-Facebook, which is interesting. But there's certainly people there from Eric Schmidt's think tank, the former CEO of Google. So, you know, I think we thought that maybe those days of the Obama administration, which was quite close to Silicon Valley, might be over because of the kind of tech clash that we've seen in the 4 years since. But it looks likely that the Democrats will continue to have a close relationship with tech, and tech will be in there doing their bidding among key decision makers. And that is something that we don't often see. I think Prop 22 is the most visible example of what is a very well-resourced, well-organized operation to advocate for the interests of these companies. And so while we might have some potential regulatory changes on foot or obvious to people, I think it's really the moment where we have to campaign to turn them into real concrete change, and not allow regulators to just do the minimum necessary, and to among the industry, those who are lobbying, to really hold back any meaningful reform. And, you know, we are seeing that there's a division in the Democratic Party, but, you know, more generally, there's an ideological question around antitrust, breaking up big companies versus privacy regulation, you know, trying to regulate the data industry and how you do that, which is the most troubling. Will companies get to have a form of regulation where it favors established players and continues to keep others out of the marketplace? These are all really difficult questions. There's a lot of complexity around it. And I like to think we're starting to get organised to demand this kind of change. I just wouldn't want the industry to be able to maximise the opportunity to contain it.
Yeah, that sort of leads into my low light, which is, you know, we've talked about the upside of connecting via technology, but also the lockdown led to this big shift in people working off platforms, and then without a real sense of what was being collected through that. You know, even what happens with Uber and Lyft with cars moved into the delivery of care via, you know, a platform like Mabel. We saw Amazon being pinged for using monitoring of employers' movements where it would suggest it was leading to some form of workplace organising, and then we learned that's while they said we're not recruiting for that sort of work, we think that's going on not just in America but in Australia as well. So that whole, I think, in the rush to find solutions, part of what's happened at the other end is we have created the workforce, and in lots of ways really well, but we're going to have to find a moment to just take stock of where we've ended in particularly in respect to workers' surveillance, how that's being used, who has control over the data and the information that's collected, and, you know, God forbid if that ends up fueling secondary markets in data, who derives the benefits from that as well. So I don't know if that's been across your radar, Ed, and whether that goes into any parts of your world, but it does seem to me to be, you know, a big shift that probably would have occurred anyway, but it's occurred in 12 months rather than, you know, 10 years.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think, you know, our colleagues at the E-Safety Commissioner's Office has also been really interested in some of the kind of dark paths that people have ended up treading because they've been, you know, more and more of their life has been kind of moving online, and some of the protections that we need have been a bit flimsy as well. I mean, that's just another issue to add to your list.
Yeah, another low light. Dan, you got a low light?
Well, there's a few, isn't there? How do you pick one? My top one's probably going to be very predictable to everyone, and that is that Facebook's announcement or threat, really, that they were going to remove news content from their platform if the code became law. Look, I mean, I just think I have lots of friends who work at Facebook, and it's actually quite difficult to criticise them. But there's a real blindness from that company, I think, in that you've got the Atriple C, one of Australia's most respected institutions, doing an 18-month review, coming up with a whole bunch of recommendations, which a democratically elected government has enacted on, and the Facebook's response to that was, well, we're just going to pack up our toys and go home. I mean, I just think it's such a ridiculous response, and shows, I think, the arrogance of that company in particular. And I'm hopeful that they'll re-engage with the process and hopefully work towards this code becoming law. So that was perhaps the top one. The other one, by the way,
before you go though, like we've spoken about this, you reckon that they want to get out of, they wouldn't mind getting out of news anyway. Talk me through that logic.
Yeah, or could you tell me, Dan, did you actually realistically think they would do that? I mean, they have said that in a few jurisdictions, and I think it's them throwing their weight around, but, or tell me what you think.
Yeah, but I mean, even if it's a threat, Lizzie, I mean, is it a responsible thing to do? Is it a, you know, I mean, whether they carry it out or not, the fact that they're threatening it, I think, is pretty problematic. Look, I don't know. I mean, this is the thing. I talk to Facebook a lot. I truthfully don't know whether or not they're going to carry this threat out or not. I have heard, though, from conversations I've had with people both inside and outside the company, that there is a view that news is just too damn hard, and all they do is get beat up over it. And maybe they want to experiment and treat. And generally, this is speculation. I don't know that this is true or not, but I've heard speculation that they want to treat Australia effectively as a bit of a test market. And if this works in Australia, then perhaps they look at rolling out something globally. I mean, I think that would change the nature of their platform quite substantially. And so therefore, I doubt that will happen. But it is interesting, isn't it, that if you think about the area where Facebook gets the most criticism, or perhaps one of the areas where they get the most criticism, it is the fact that they're either not taking down enough content or not policing it enough, or they're allowing too much to go through, and they're a threat to democracy. And this, if they became, I think that there's a view inside the company from some people at least, if they became the place of cat videos and high school reunions, it would be much easier for them. Oh,
and conspiracy theories and disinformation.
There is that.
It's an interesting tell, isn't it? That assuming this conversation is going on, they do not see a commercial benefit in circulating fact-based news, therefore they wouldn't do it, which means that they don't actually see their platform as supporting a greater good.
Yeah, well, but this is the thing. I think they do see their platform as supporting a greater good, but the problem is that they're sort of blind to the harms that come with the upside of what their platform delivers. And you would think, I mean, I would argue, obviously, perhaps this is probably going to be the most obvious thing you'll hear all day, but with the huge power that their platform has, they've got this massive responsibility to actually take moderation seriously and actually make sure that their platform is a place of genuine fact-based information rather than disinformation. And as we've said many times in these talks over the year, I don't think they're taking that responsibility seriously.
One of the difficulties from our perspective is that sometimes the size of a platform like Facebook is used as a kind of a justification for them not being responsive to even a country the size of Australia. Just to give a kind of a micro example of that, before I was in this role, I was a lawyer. We had a really upsetting case. It involved an Aboriginal client whose relative had died, and the practice at Facebook at the time was that they would kind of, when they got wind of someone who's a Facebook user dying, they'd put like a carousel of photos of that person kind of on their page, and then their page would be locked down. As we all know, for cultural reasons, showing photos of people who are Aboriginal people who are deceased can be hugely problematic. And so we thought it would be just a pretty straightforward thing. We'd kind of write to Facebook, it would be all resolved pretty quickly and simply. But it was one of the most complex kind of pieces of legal jiu-jitsu I've ever had to kind of engage in. It took an incredibly long time. They were really difficult about it. And but part of their justification kept on being, you know what, we're not going to do this thing, that affects maybe 3% of the population of Australia, when we're a global company and we've got to make policies that operate globally. Ultimately, they did move on this, but it was incredibly difficult to do that. And I guess that's, I think, what we're finding in a different way with the platforms issue as well, which is that that they want to have kind of a consistent approach across the entire world, and obviously, perhaps like most companies, they want it to be consistent in a way that works best for them.
That scale is a huge problem, though, isn't it, Ed? I mean, this is the thing, and I don't think we can. I agree they often use it as an excuse, and therefore that's problematic. But this is such a massive problem to solve by virtue of the scale, by virtue of the fact that they're operating in different territories with different regulations and laws and cultural norms. And I think it is. I'm not for a second, by the way, suggesting this is an easy problem to solve. I think it's an incredibly difficult problem. But I also think take some of the record profits that you're making. These are the richest people on the planet, and accept the fact you're going to have to be a far less profitable company and take your responsibility seriously. That's ultimately the outcome of this, and far more active moderation and accepting the fact that your algorithm has you operating more like a publisher than a phone book. I think that is fundamental to them actually accepting what the responsibility they need to accept in order to make their platform as good as it can be.
I would say though, one of the things I would say in response to that, this is why this phrase coming out of the US that every billionaire is a policy problem. And I think this is an example of that. No one should be making billions out of any industry, but this is an example where having billionaires controlling this kind of what is essentially infrastructure is very problematic, and designing for the average person rather than for perhaps the most vulnerable person is a mistake. And maybe we do need to start experimenting with more localized versions of these platforms, because they're more specific and likely to be more nuanced for that population. And this is the complaint by people who aren't white men all the time, that this kind of technology is designed for people who habit the offices of Silicon Valley, which don't look like me, tend to, but also don't look like Aboriginal people, and that's a big problem. They end up making design decisions that they shouldn't do, in my view, unless they can be confident that they're going to be able to patch up or make amendments to address harm before it occurs, or that it's not going to cause harm, which is just a very high bar to meet, but it's not impossible. The other thing I would just say about Facebook, though, is I think it's interesting to reflect on where we've come with that company, because it wasn't long ago that they were proposing their own currency. They were, I remember watching this presentation that Mark Zuckerberg had where he talked about all the things that they wanted you to be able to do on Facebook, like going on dates, applying for jobs. They really want it to be like a web that you don't ever have to leave. And that's no longer their rhetoric. That's certainly not what they pitch themselves. And in fact, I think they're alive to the fact that to talk about themselves in that way would actually be inviting more criticism, a more potential regulatory focus, although I'm not sure how you could get more than what they're currently facing as of yesterday. But I do think it's interesting that those ambitions have had to be reined back. And so while it can often feel like this company is kind of all-powerful, unassailable, I think that's probably not the case. And I think there probably are people within the company now who are revisiting those ambitions, and that's a good thing for us, and that's important to remember at this particular moment.
I think it also leads into that notion of social license. To Ed's point before, when Facebook and Google are seen as being drivers of the future and, you know, cool and exciting, it's one story. But when there's a greater acceptance of the negative consequences, it feeds into lots of things. It's interesting. As a total sidebar, one of the if anyone invests in ethical shares, your portfolio has done really well this year. And it's not because of renewable energy, it's because that a lot of the ethical investments are based around Alphabet and Facebook as core investments. And even the idea of them sitting there as an ethical investment, I think is really interesting. Anyway, let's think about the year ahead. And I might actually kick this off, bouncing off the back of Facebook. I think the opportunity is starting to emerge, to your point, Lizzie, that there's an opportunity to reimagine what a network should be. Like, who would have thought that a global corporation that purported to set up the connections for every individual in the world would end up running for their interest and not the public interest? Like, is there another way of rethinking this from the ground up? I know we've been doing a bit of thinking at Centre Responsible Technology about what a publicly funded public interest platform could look like over time and what the bits you'd need to build in to make it work in the public interest and not in state interest, for instance. But I think that thinking feels more, it feels like there's more of an appetite for it, and it doesn't feel like just a debating society at the moment, because, you know, with the movements in the States, the movements in Europe and here, it does feel like there is an accounting, and that idea that they're just too big to even question is under a little bit of under a bit of assault at the moment. So I'm really optimistic about next year and the thinking that can go forward with people that really want to get their head around these issues, and recognizing, of course, that there's not just one view, and it's not anti-tech, it's about the political economy of tech, which is why I've, you know, loved these discussions so much as well. But, you know, I'll bounce back to you, Lizzie, and then we'll go around the group. What do you think 2021 holds, and what's your sort of, you know, your dream script for the next 12 months?
Yeah, well, just to follow on from that, Nicola's made a good comment there, which is about interoperability being a key requirement and a key reform. The requirement that you be able to move a service that you receive from one company to another company, if that was imposed, it would radically transform the political economy of the web. And I think Nicola's right to point that out. And that would be a reform that government could make and would avoid then it just treating one of these platforms and accepting it as part of the infrastructure, and instead try to build a diverse environment for different kinds of services to be offered. So anyway, I think that's an interesting kind of potential addendum to what you were talking about. I mean, I think there's lots of potential, certainly at Digital Rights Watch. One of the things we're trying to think about a lot more is what would a kind of an Australian-based web look like. Australia sits at a funny place, I think, in some ways. We're obviously not the United States or the United Kingdom, but we are a member of the Five Eyes, the Intelligence Sharing Alliance. So we have a stake in how those countries kind of progress their particular surveillance agenda, or those governments do that. But we're also, you know, we're an English-speaking country that uses products that come out of the United States or from companies that are headquartered in the United States. We don't necessarily have all the regulatory tools available to us to regulate them or to try and influence them in the way that the US does with, you know, bringing applications for companies to demerge and the like. And so I think it is worth thinking about what an Australian kind of web would look like and what we'd want out of that, how we could, advocate for rights without necessarily being in the heart of the beast, but also we're not a country that contends with issues around the kind of basic integrity of our democracy, or attacks on journalists. While there are some in this country, are nowhere near as bad as some of our nearby neighbours, for example. So, you know, we've got a semi-robust legal system and political system. What would it look like to kind of improve that in a context in which a lot of the targets of our concerns are based abroad? And that's certainly what we're going to be spending our time thinking about. I think it is an interesting question to ponder. How could we make the web more specific to Australia, so you don't get the kinds of problems that Ed was talking about before with the use of photos, but you've also got the chance to kind of create our own identity. Just not that we're just going to be harmed by these companies and governments, but that we're going to have our own sovereign identity and a place in which it reflects our needs and wants as a society, and a place in which we can have public debates that are progressive. So, you know, watch this space. Digital Rights Watch plans to spend quite a bit of time thinking about this and talking about it, and that's what we're going to be doing in 2021.
Ed, that's kind of a lead into your optimistic vision for 2021. I think I know what you want in your Christmas stocking, but what are you hoping for the year ahead?
Look, I'm a lawyer. I want more law, and particularly convenience law. No, I mean, look, I think one of the things that's been very interesting as we've seen the rise of new tech in so many different areas of our lives is that we've kind of lost our head a little bit about what the rules are or how we enforce them. And I'm really hopeful that in 2021, that's really going to kind of change quite profoundly. Just a little bit of sizzle. We've got our big report coming out earlier in the year, and we're really excited about that being tabled. To give it a practical example or an illustration, what I mean is, imagine you go into a bank and you speak to the human bank manager asking for a bank loan, and the bank manager says, you know what, no, you're a woman, we don't give loans to women, no way. We wouldn't be under any illusions there. That would clearly be discrimination, right? But if all of that happened online, you apply for the same person applying for the bank loan, and it's an algorithm that determines that you don't get the bank loan, and it's the algorithm that is basically completely stuffed up. It's engaged in what I was describing before as algorithmic bias, and you're being disadvantaged because you're a woman. It just, you don't get told that. We somehow kind of lose our heads about it. We say, oh, well, this might be an ethical problem, or it might be, you know, something that we should, you know, really frown on. It's not. It's a legal problem. It is just as discriminatory. It is just as bad. In some ways, it's worse because it's more hidden. And I think some of these debates about, you know, the ethics of AI and the ethics of tech, I think have been real distractions from what we need to focus on, which is that we're using technology to do things that we've always done on the whole, but just in new ways. And so a loan decision is a loan decision, whether, you know, it's using an abacus or whether it's using artificial intelligence. And so we should treat it as such. And I'm really hopeful that next year will be the year where, with the kind of growing realization that I described right at the start, we then take a much more rigorous approach in applying some of the existing laws that are there to protect us, but also filling some of the gaps in the law that that perhaps, you know, exist because some of this new technology is just that, it's new.
And to Lizzie's point about imagining an Australian web with Australian values, what I love about your work is this idea of embedding discrimination law into the DNA of technology in Australia, is almost embedding the fair go into our technical, I don't know, ecosystem.
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
Exciting. That's exciting.
It's really exciting. And I think just as, you know, when we see those really jarring reports and frankly distressing and disturbing reports from countries like China about the use of so-called social credit schemes in major cities, and then, you know, tools of active repression in places like Xinjiang, we go, well, this is not us. This is not what we want at all. I mean, I think our citizens would be, you know, absolutely crystal clear about that. And so, what's the choice? I think the choice is to innovate in a way that is consistent with our liberal democratic values. And I think we have an opportunity to do that. But that opportunity will will close over time as we become more and more reliant on tech developed by others. And if we continue to have maybe too soft a voice internationally in terms of actually standing up for those liberal democratic values, including human rights.
Although, as Eric asks in the chat, we can't even get international companies to pay tax. So how can we get them to follow Australian law?
Look, I'm no tax expert, but that's often a choice, right? We could be, I guess, more demanding of companies who operate in Australia to pay taxes, as we could be more demanding of them that they comply with basic laws in other areas as well.
Dan, what's your Christmas wish?
I might talk about three things. The first one, again, probably an obvious one given my position, but one of the things, perhaps another highlight from this year, which I'm hoping is going to carry on next year, is we've seen, obviously this year has accelerated digital trends in a way, and there's been lots of downsides to that as we've covered on today's conversation. But one of the benefits has been a restored level of trust in news media organisations and with government for that matter. And I certainly hope that from the Guardian's perspective, we're going to see that continue. I mean, we've seen massive record audience growth, and now off the back of that, really strong financial growth as well. We're in a much stronger position than we were at the start of this year before anyone had heard of coronavirus, which is kind of remarkable when you think about it, when you think about how existential this crisis looked like at the beginning of it. So I'm looking forward to building on that next year, and I genuinely hope that all media, all news media, because I think it's, as I've said, is a public good. I hope that it continues to grow strongly next year. The second thing, which is kind of top of mind, just because we're talking about it a lot at the moment, is we're starting to talk about bringing our teams back into the office again, and they're definitely going to be far more flexible than they were previously. It's probably an obvious thing to say, but work has really become something you do rather than somewhere you go. And I think I'm really looking forward to mapping out a way with our team, and I know other companies are doing the same thing, that's actually going to be better for the workers as well as for the company. And it's something which I guess I was so old-fashioned and just always had the view that everyone needed to be in the office 5 days a week prior to this pandemic, and I don't think that way anymore. And I think there's a lot of people like me. So I think that's another good. And the last one I think probably touches on what all three of you have in fact said, and that is I hope we continue to sort of reimagine tech as a public square rather than just a private kind of commercial making enterprise. Pete, you've been prosecuting this idea of perhaps the ABC running their version of a social network or something like that. I think these kinds of ideas really have merit, and there's a lot of people that are starting to talk about them around the world now, not just in Australia. And I really hope that we start to see some traction so that there's more Wikipedias and there's more of those kinds of companies which are actually tech companies which are genuinely motivated on nothing but public good and community and bringing people together rather than maximising profit based on an advertising algorithm. So I hope that trend continues, and I hope we actually see some more Wikipedias basically, and hopefully the beginnings of those kind of things into next year and beyond.
Absolutely. Hey, it feels amazing we've got through the year, and just talking about next year just reinforces it doesn't stop, does it? We're not sure what comes of this next year. It's been really fun doing this every second Friday. I think we did one, and then Lizzie said, why don't we keep it going? And we've kind of kept it going.
I don't remember saying that, Peter. Just put it out there.
Well, wasn't that you that said that, Peter?
Maybe I just kept inviting you and you kept turning up. I don't know. Everyone loves the sound of their own voice in this group, so it's great.
True.
So I reckon next year we might keep this going. We might start a bit of a blog so we can share ideas off the back of it or find a home. I think some of the ideas we kind of capture, and I know that Amy's been amazing in sharing her intel and maybe sort of set up a bit more of a home base of which the talk's part of. Maybe we'll get some face-to-face in different places and do a few, tech talks in the pub or something. Like, there's a huge amount of opportunity, but what I really love with you guys is that we've all been working it out as we go along, not just the technology, not just the way these sessions work, but also the way to sort of imagine the future with different political traditions, different, I guess, ideological frameworks. But it's been great fun from my perspective, and I've really appreciated all of you, and also particularly Ed's support, right throughout the year. So, hey, thanks everyone. I actually am meant to be going off to my office Christmas lunch. they said it. I said, no, I've got to do Tech Talk. So I've got to go and join the second course. But happy Christmas, happy New Year to everyone. And yeah, I don't know if anyone wants to say one last bye, but thanks, guys. It's been awesome.
Yeah, I've had an amazing time.
I'll just jump in and say an echo. You go, Lizzie.
You go. Oh, well, I just think it's awesome being able to do this by Zoom. Like, I think that we have definitely been learning, but it's always been, the audience in these talks have always come with interesting, informed questions. And it's such a joy to talk to all of you and see repeat faces come up every fortnight. This is one of the great things, like working from home. I agree, Dan, it's kind of a shame that we didn't think to mention it earlier, but also being into people's homes, you know, meetings interrupted by babies, by dogs, all that stuff. I think making us more human at work has just been a real joy. And this is one example where I think we've had to learn as we go, but we've made it work. And the response from the audience has been fantastic. So I'm very grateful for everyone who helps put it together, but shows up, I suppose, is my point, and participates, because it really does warm my heart as a society that we're trying to grapple with these problems. It's nice to see people who are so engaged in them.
Yeah, and I'd echo that. I was going to say, again, very similar things. I've really enjoyed the conversations, even if it's been largely me with thought bubbles, figuring them out in the public forum. But so thanks for putting up with me as we did that. But I've genuinely enjoyed the conversation. I think the quality of the questions and engagement from all of you as well has been remarkable. I am looking forward to meeting you in person, Lizzie, because I think we've had more conversations than I've had with most people, and I still don't know, we still haven't sat down and shared a meal. So hopefully at some stage, Peter, that's one request I have, that we do one of these, at least one more of these, where the three of us are in the same location, and we can actually have a conversation that way. That would be amazing.
Mm.
And I'm really alarmed by that suggestion. I've lost the capacity to interact with people face to face in reality.
Everybody looks down at about their chin because they're used to eye contact via the Zoom. Hey, and to Dylan's point, yes, more diverse views we're always looking for. And I know Dylan's been really active in the chat at pushing us and challenging us. So good on you too, and have a good new year, Dylan, and we'll see you in the new year too. Guys, I'm going to put a pin in it so I get there for the second course. But thanks again, everybody. And yeah, take care.
Thanks all.